Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever struggled with people who treat you like dirt, then do we have the Asshole Survival Guide show for you. Today I'll be talking with Robert Sutton, Stanford University Professor and organizational psychologist, and the New York Times best-selling author of The No Asshole Rule and Good Boss, Bad Boss, and his latest, The Asshole Survival Guide. And that's just what I want to talk with him about today, about how to deal with people who treat you like dirt. That plus we'll talk about rule Nazis and petty tyrants, safety zones and invisible cloaks, Da Vinci and Benjamin Franklin, the power of quitting, why when you're in a meeting you need to call your 86-year-old mom, gotcha, and what in the world black pens, eyeglasses, and Bugsy has to do with anything. So welcome to the show, Bob. Are you ready to shine?
I'm ready to shine. That was quite an introduction. Let's go.
Woo! So I am almost afraid to ask, and I will say it once, and then we're going to start bleep. I guess we'll bleep a bit in the beginning, then we'll phase in. My poor editor. How'd you come to be known as the asshole guy?
Oh, wow. It sure is an accident. I thought of myself, I may even still think of myself as a normal academic who studies organizational change and leadership and stuff like that. But back in, I'm thinking 2003 or so, there was a couple of things going on in my life that got me more interested in the problem of, we're going to use the word jerk. So the problem of jerks and how they're a vexing problem for all of us, and it would be nice to do something about it. The first one was in my little department at Stanford University, my little academic department. We actually had a no jerk rule, and the way that we would hire people was on the basis of them not being jerks. And I still remember one of my colleagues, he's now gone, Bob Carlson. He said, we were talking about a really famous academic who we were thinking about hiring, and Bob looks up and he says, I don't care if that guy wins a Nobel Prize. I don't want any jerks in our group ruining our great culture. So then we started adopting the rule. So that's one hand. Mm-hmm. The other hand, my wife, who has had quite a few different careers, but she was for 25 years a corporate lawyer. And around that time, she was managing partner of a large law firm that had about 1,000 lawyers, maybe a few less, but a lot of lawyers. And the way law firms are, for better or worse, there can, especially in litigation, by the way, there can be people who are real jerks who have the inability to turn off their nastiness and hostility when they work with staff or fellow lawyers. So jerk management, to not use the word, what was a big part of her job. It's probably 50% of her job was to try to get these people to calm down and to give them feedback. So I started writing a little bit about it. And as I say, I write about things like leadership. I write about organizational change and innovation. I couldn't believe how strong the response was. So I wrote a little Harvard Business Review article. I wrote one book, and then it's 10 years since the last book. And the first book was mostly about organizational culture, how to build a relatively jerk-free organizational culture. But the main question people wanted to know was, if you can see it from the opening page, I got a jerk or a bunch in my life. What do I do? So eventually I lost control and wrote another book, and here we are.
You lost control and wrote another book. I like it. So we have a rule here in people that we work with Inspire Nation and with our previous businesses, which is the huggability factor. So we take it one step more. You've got that going. So we would do business with you.
So the co-author of my last book, So Help Me, his name is Huggy Rao. His name's Hayagriva. He is the most huggable, lovable guy, but it's pretty funny. So I have an actual co-author who's brilliant and charming, Huggy Rao. So I'm with you. I'm for that. You should meet. He's very huggable, and he'd actually be great on your show too. He's brilliant.
I love it. We'll talk about it afterwards. We could have fun with Huggy.
He's perfectly named.
Excellent. So I have a confession to make here. Years ago, I think it was around 2000, I was working in the fashion and apparel industry, and I walked into my controller's office, and she wasn't very kind with me. She was kind of gruff, And I said, well, you can speak honest with me. It's okay. She goes, why don't you close the door? I closed the door, and she goes, Michael, you're an asshole.
No.
And she was right. And I didn't know it. And we actually became best friends after that, and certainly more than healed that relationship. And I learned a lot about myself through that process and how I interact with others. And so you have a bias-busting mantra here that maybe we should start things out with.
Yes. So my mantra, I thought you were going to say it. My mantra is, and it took me a long time to get there from research, my own experience. I have some of those experiences too, Michael. We're not alone that way. And also just hearing from all of these people who have these problems with jerks. So the mantra is to be slow to label other people as jerks and to be quick to label yourself. And the reason I say that is there's so much research on self-awareness that shows that especially when it comes to weaknesses, we are actually the last people to know. And I love your story. The reason I love your story is that's the kind of person who's giving you a gift. And the gift that you can have, that we can all have in our life, is to have people in our life who know us well, who I think she actually cared about you from what you're saying. She wasn't saying it just to bring you down, and she wanted to help you and probably help her coworkers too. And having people in our lives who can tell us the truth. Sometimes it's coworkers, sometimes it's spouses. I talk in the book about how Winston Churchill's wife, Clementine, there was a point, June 1940, that the U.S. wasn't in the war yet. They were losing. It was just a very hellish time. And his wife, Clementine, wrote him a note that said, Dear Winston, you're not as kind as you used to be. And I'm getting reports from your staff, and you're going to intimidate them. You're going to set the tone for bad behavior for the good of the country and for the good of the people you work with. It would be better if you were more civil. And that's kind of what that person did to you. And sometimes it's hard to hear those things. But to me, if we treated one another like that, and I don't use this phrase very often, the world really would be a better place. And so your coworker, it sounds like, gave you a gift.
It truly was a gift. It was I don't even know if bittersweet. I took it well. I was able to step back and go, what can I learn from this experience? Clearly I have something to gain, and she's going out on a limb to share it with me.
Yeah, that's it. The fashion industry is tough too. I mean, if you're going to pick an industry that behavior is constant, I mean, that's so good for you in that industry in particular.
Thank you. So let's go from there and talk about people who have jerk problems. We're going to use that word jerk here most of the time. How do we figure out if we do have a jerk problem?
Well, if we're talking about situations where the other people are the jerks, so we've already established.
Yes, we're establishing if you're the jerk, we get to work on you, and there's a lot to be done there. But if we think that somebody else may be a jerk in our lives or in our work, how do we tell?
We're surrounded. Well, to me, there's certain things that you want to kind of figure out the situation, and I've got these kind of diagnostic questions in the book, and I'll touch on a couple of them that are especially valuable. One is, if you're dealing with jerks, you might want to figure out, and I hate to be tacky, but power really does matter. Is it somebody who is your boss or your boss's boss? Or is it somebody who is actually below the hierarchy with you? Because honestly, if it's an underling or subordinate who's treating others badly, you have a lot of power. One of my heroes in the book, his name is Paul Purcell. He even blurbed the book. He's was chairman and was CEO and is now chairman of Baird, which is a big financial services company, very successful. And they've been on the best place to work list for Fortune 100 best companies to work for 14 years. So they're famous for we're going to use the word jerk. He uses the other word. They have a no jerk rule. So I'm interviewing Paul about, I don't know, this is about 4 or 5 years ago. He says, so I tell people during the interview, if I discover they're a jerk, I'm going to fire them. And he does fire people. Well, most of us don't have that power, that luxury, if you will. So that's one thing you got to figure out, is how much power you have relative to the jerks around you. The other thing is just the duration. There's a lot of times when you're dealing with somebody who is just a short-term jerk problem. Maybe I studied coffee baristas as part of this. If they've got a jerk customer, as bad as it is, they're probably not going to see that person again. And it's only going to last a few minutes. So it's short. And then the other thing is whether it's a temporary or a certified jerk. If it's somebody who is usually a good person but is losing it, that's much different. And then the final thing that I would really emphasize in kind of analyzing your situation, we all have different degrees of toughness, sensitivity, and I think the evidence in the book is on average, if you're around rude, disrespectful people, it's bad for your mental health, it's bad for your physical health, it's bad for your productivity. But some of us are just tougher than others, or we're in a situation that brings out the best or the worst of us. And if we're really suffering, if we're having trouble sleeping, if we're having trouble with our relationships with important people in our life, if we've stopped exercising, if our productivity and imagination is going down, to me, that's a sign that you've really got to do something and possibly get out too.
What if you get an internal memo that says $10 to anybody who guesses correctly the next person to be fired?
that was one of the examples. Yeah, so this was a sort of one of those it's a quick stop. It's sort of like a 7-Eleven type store. Yeah, that was sort of a really sad situation where this owner of a bunch of these little stores sent out this note and this woman quit, which I thought that was a pretty sensible reason to quit. And the judge, and he didn't want to pay unemployment insurance. And what ended up happening was that the judge ruled in her favor. But yeah, that's a sign you're in a jerky workplace and maybe it's time to get out. But there's lots of other reasons when it's time to get out too.
What then is and this kind of is what we were talking about. What's a jerk, for lack of the other word? I really want to go with the other word. But what is a jerk factory?
Oh, a jerk factory. Yeah, this is so. By the way, it's great to be interviewed by somebody who read the book because this doesn't always happen. So I'm really excited. So a jerk factory to me, and there's a difference between if you've kind of got just one person who's driving you crazy, then that's different because you can maybe avoid them. You maybe can have allies. But if you get into one of these organizations or one of these teams, and goodness knows I've been in them, and many of us have been in them, where it's kind of like the movie The Lord of the Flies, where everybody is nasty. Those kind of situations are really difficult to deal with because there's often nowhere to hide. And there's two other problems, too, if you're in a situation like that, which is, and this is one of the most robust findings about nasty behavior, rudeness, bullying, just obnoxiousness, that it spreads like the common cold. That when somebody's nasty to you and everybody around you is nasty, you're probably going to become one too. And I don't know if it's worse or better, but when you're in a situation where everybody is nasty, if you don't fight back some, you're going to be in trouble. So you kind of got to be a jerk to fend off the other jerks. So when you're in one of those jerk city situations, it's this whole sort of cluster of nastiness that is much more difficult to deal with. If you're in a situation like that, getting out is probably especially important because the long-term damage is so high.
It makes me think, I think it was a Stanford study, correct me if I'm wrong, a study that was done a long time ago, probably in the 60s, about inmates and guards. That
Phil Zimbardo, yes. Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
Well, you probably know more about it than me, but things went awry, and whether we want to call it human nature or people acting like jerks, the jerk situation got way out of control.
Well, this famous, the Stanford prison experiment, where literally this guy, Phil Zimbardo, turned the basement of the Stanford psychology department into a prison. And he had people sign up for the study. I know way too much about the study. And he said, we're going to pick you up at your house on Saturday morning. For the people who were put in the prison situation, I don't think this would happen now. He got the Palo Alto Police Department to go to their house and to process them through the system. So they got in the role of being sort of like prisoners, and the guards, they started wearing sunglasses and started getting sort of nasty. But that's one of those things where when you put people in stereotype roles, and this is very important because when we're in powerful situations, our nastiness comes out. You have big power differences. You have an outside enemy. That's where things get really nasty. If you look for situations where there's going to be unpleasant behavior, power differences, hostility, that's a classic situation. And of course, in the back of their mind was all the TV movies they'd seen about prisons and how people behave. So they had models in those days. Cool Hand Luke was one of the movies, for example.
Wow. And it got out of control, and they had to stop it early because the prison guards went crazy.
Went crazy. So this is the problem. And you talk about what brings out jerks behavior. People who have power are really difficult. And there's this social psychological finding. And you also see this replicated, by the way, in research on air rage. Too, where you got first class and you've got the people in coach, which is, they call it envy up, scorn down. So when in addition to the fact that power sort of makes people insensitive, there's sort of an anger between classes. And you got to be really careful when you create those sort of big status differences in organizations that are unnecessary.
Interesting. So as I'm looking at first class yesterday, which got water on the flight, and we didn't.
Of course not. See, you're envious, and as you should have been, but you should have gotten water too, by the way.
So I'm going, how many hundreds of dollars would it cost to get water? They said it's a short flight, so they were only going to give water to first class.
Oh, that's terrible. That's a pretty basic human need. It's not like the little towels. That's
no, one would think. So let's talk about a few other fun people, and then we'll talk about some solutions to this. First off, petty tyrants.
Oh, so we're talking about different. Petty tyrants are my least favorite and favorite kind of jerk. So there's all sorts of jerks. There's narcissists, but petty tyrants, we've actually got some interesting research. And to back up, when you put a human being in a situation where they have power over the fate of other people, but they are not respected, this is one of the worst ways to bring out bad behavior in people. So you think of at the Department of Motor Vehicles, the poor person in those terrible jobs behind the desk. You think of at Stanford, where I work, I think of the people who approve our expense accounts. They're not particularly respected, but they have a lot of power over whether or not I can get my flight fully reimbursed or something like that. And then one that I talk about in the book are cooks. So you have cooks in restaurants. They're sort of essential, but they're not really, and I'm not talking about chefs, they're not really respected. So when you put people in situations where they have what they call low stature or low prestige, but high power, they tend to take it out on other people. So, and the project I'm working on now after this is going to be on causes of organizational friction. They put in both conflict and also making simple things hard to do. They will make you jump through hoops just to push you around. And I think we've all been in this situation. And so that's the bad news. And I personally really despise petty tyrants, but through my research and actually family members too, I've come to learn that what do petty tyrants need?
Love.
They need love and respect. And so one thing I'm trying to do, even in my own life, and I'm going to be really careful here, but there's a petty tyrant who's been driving me crazy for years. I've tried everything else. So I think I'm going to try giving her some respect and see if it actually helps, because that's what they need. They need love and respect.
Woohoo! So let's go on to another fun one here, which is rule Nazis.
Rule Nazis are a special kind of petty tyrant. A rule Nazi is somebody who insists that you do everything exactly the way that it should be done. So to me, it's you fill out the form in the bank and you scratch out and try to re-sign it, and they make you redo the whole thing over and over again. Or another kind of classic rule Nazis. One of my colleagues, Katie DeSell, is actually studying people like this. So this is the coworker who, when you arrive 2 minutes late, yells at you for being 2 minutes late, even though they're not your boss and your boss doesn't care. The kind of person who, when you keep your food in the refrigerator 1 day too late, puts it on your desk with a nasty note. People like that can just drive us all absolutely crazy. So there is a positive side to it, because sometimes they are really great perfectionists and can, see flaws in things. So so people like that can be useful in some ways. But rule Nazis, they also drive me crazy. And in that case, it's more complicated, because just a little bit of love and respect might help. but also getting them to back off and maybe bringing your boss in is not the worst idea either.
I'm thinking of Seinfeld and the soup Nazis, and then an experience like it back when I was in the apparel industry. I went out to lunch one day at a Chinese food restaurant with a cousin in from out of town, and ordered a meal, asked for a substitution, got my food, started eating it. The CEO and CFO in the company are sitting elsewhere in the restaurant when the owner comes up and says, "Did you ask for a substitution?" and kicked me out. And they were dying laughing.
Now that's a rule Nazi who has got his sense of this is my place. Oh, that's perfect.
What do we do with rule Nazis? We give them as much love as we can. Anything else we can do with them?
Boy, I wouldn't go back to that restaurant.
No, that was a given. All right, let's go with another one. And I've got to figure out how to say this. So I'm just gonna folks, you can guess what I'm saying here. What is a grin effer?
Oh, a grin. A grin. So what that is, and it's really funny because I've since figured out this is sort of a standard expression in Silicon Valley out here where I'm at, for better or worse.
Oh no,
this is the coworker, or if you're a boss, and the CEO of a local tech company told me about his grin effer and all the problems he was having with him. This is the kind of person who you bring him into the team meeting. In this case, he was talking about his grin effer, and he's just, yes, boss, and flattery, and God, you look good today, and yes, that's a great idea. Oh, so it's all sort of kissing up and telling you how brilliant you are. Then you send him off to do the order. So this case was actually a new supply chain system, was part of an elaborate story. He bad mouths you behind your back. He talks about how stupid you and your idea are. He tries to screw up the implementation or doesn't do it at all. And then you come back and you say, so what happened? And you get the same treatment again. And honestly, that sort of behavior, which is pretty nasty and pretty hard to take, to me, sometimes that's a sign that there might be something wrong with that person. Mm-hmm. If there's only one person doing it. But if you're a leader and everybody in your team is treating you that way, you may be unwittingly creating that behavior. And sometimes when subordinates don't follow the rules of their leaders, and the commands of their leaders, when they think they're dumb and they know they can't challenge them directly, sometimes they're actually protecting the organization by doing that. So there are some grin effers who are actually doing things for the greater good, but other ones are just on weird power trips and want to screw over their boss. So you kind of got to look at the situation you're in. But yeah, I had this whole thing, this Silicon Valley CEO told me about this grin effer who it took him months to figure out that he was literally ruining the company's implementation of its strategy.
Wow. And going along the lines, if we back up half a step, what you said in there is so important. And I can think of Adam Grant, who you mentioned.
I love Adam, yes.
He talks about being a two-way street, so that this isn't necessarily, if there's a problem going on the other side, you need to look at yourself and maybe even ask for help.
Right. Yeah, and that's, I did about 40. I've known Adam a long time, before he was famous, because we went to the same PhD program. And he's astounding. But Adam and I always are talking about the notion from his research that if you just take and take and take and take from people and you don't give anything back, those are the kind of people who will start working on bringing you down, and perhaps even rationally, because if you're just such a selfish person that you aren't doing things for the greater good, then maybe you shouldn't be in a position of power, and you're not going to be a very useful team member either. I think of the days when my wife was managing partner of her large law firm. Mm-hmm. There were some attorneys who were very prestigious in terms of bringing in business, but it would be a constant problem that they would be treating others badly. They would constantly be overclaiming how much business they brought in. They'd constantly be bad-mouthing others. And you have people like that, it's all about me. And for the greater good of an organization and for our lives, people like that aren't very constructive. They just aren't very helpful.
what's fascinating, if I understand this story right, and if we extrapolate or look more to the future, one of them came around to you 10 years ago after you wrote your first book on this subject, and said that thankfully I'm not one of those kind of people. I'm one of the good people.
Believe you really did read carefully. So this is an amazing story. So in the first book, this is a different one. So in the first book, I described this incident, and this is a big issue for the people who are watching the show. The best way to avoid the damage caused by jerks is to not get involved with them in the first place, to do a little reconnaissance. You're talking about Adam Grant. Adam talks about socially constructive gossip. Mm-hmm. So you sort of use your social network and do whatever you can to find out. And so this is my wife. When she was a young attorney, she got offered this job by a really famous litigator out here in Silicon Valley, and she was all excited about it. Right before she accepts the job, she gets a call from an associate who'd worked for this guy for years and just lays out what a terrible person this guy is. So she doesn't accept the job. To reinforce this sort of story, he calls her up, yells at her, and starts putting pressure on her to identify the person who outed him. So my wife was, compared to me, very mostly controlled person, said, gee, I'm sorry you're upset, but your behavior in this phone call confirms my decision. It hangs up. Okay, so that's the story. 10 years later, I'm at a talk. I was actually talking about entrepreneurship and evidence-based management. Mm-hmm. The same guy walks up to me and tells me how much he loves my work and how he prides himself in not being a jerk. And so this is the self-awareness thing that we started at the top of the hour. In somebody like that, I kind of have two reactions. It's just sort of like a bizarre situation. Like, you are in my book. Well, now he's in two books as a jerk, and he still doesn't quite understand or identify who he is. Maybe he will figure out eventually. I think he knows who my wife is, and we have different names. But the other part about it is, well, somebody like that needs somebody to help them, like that person helped you years ago. And we really do need each other to deal with these sort of problems, both to cope with the jerks and to identify when we're being bad and doing damage, because I don't really think this particular person wants to be known this way, but doesn't quite have the level of self-awareness and skill to deal with it, even though he's a world-famous attorney.
Hopefully someday.
Yes.
We send him love. So from there, let's talk about making a clean getaway. And what do you mean that you believe in quitting?
Oh, so I do believe in quitting, but I also believe in not being stupid about it. So if you're in a bad situation mm-hmm. where it's jerk city, as we're calling it, or you've got a coworker or a boss who is so damaging that you just realize it's better for you to get out, and this is a wise idea. But I talked about the example of this JetBlue flight attendant, Steven Slater. He was a hero in the media. He's being abused.
He went out with a bang.
Unbelievable. So the plane lands, and I think the final blow was he'd been screamed at by these. The flight attendants have such hard jobs. God bless them. I mean, those things are so hard. So the plane lands, and while it's still taxiing, the woman who's been yelling at him stands up, opens the overhead bin, and the luggage falls on his head. So this is like the final blow. So you got to feel bad for this guy. So he gets pissed off. He gets on the microphone, cusses out the entire plane, takes 2 beers, and activates the emergency slide, and then he's a national folk hero, right? Well, he got on probation. He had to pay back JetBlue. I mean, he actually felt terrible. He did not mean to do this to himself. So to me, that's sort of a parable that if you're in a bad situation, you've got to get out. But to quote one of my dear friends, Michael Deering, there's a difference between what you do and how you do it. And to the extent that you can do it, even if you're trying to help your other coworkers and send the message that there's some nastiness that's got to be dealt with, try to do it in such a way that allows you to keep your dignity and so on intact. There might be some situations where it's so extreme that you got to go to litigation and it might get nasty, but on average, going there last, I think, is the thing to do.
Thank you. So from there, let's talk about jerk blindness, and this is something we joked about before the show, because there's a top 10 list of denial here, and I couldn't help but read it this morning as we're deciding evacuate, not evacuate, and how soon do we evacuate. from the upcoming, you said denial is denial.
Right. So let's see. This is the thing about writing a book; it's hard to remember in it. But the idea.
I can list off a few good ones here for you.
Yeah, so it's not that bad. It's going to get better.
It's not that bad. It's only going to get better. Things are going to get much better soon. I'll leave right after I finish this one more.
That's me. This one more interview with this guy I'm talking to right now. So to me, and later on in the book, I talk about how there's mind tricks to protect your soul when you can't get out.
Oh, and you'll have to tell us about Becky next. We'll jump to her.
We'll jump to Becky Margiotta. But to me, one of the things that happens, and one guy in particular just wrote me about how he just worked in this terrible situation for 8 or 10 years, and he used all the things. It's not that bad. It's going to get better. My jerky boss is going to leave soon. I just have one more project that I'm going to finish. And then, pretty soon, one day you're 30, the next day you're 60, you still got one more project to finish. They never really end. And you're there, and then your life has been lesser as a result. So that idea about coming to grips with when you're in pain and when you're suffering, and I really do go back to this notion. There's all these different things that can be the characteristics of the jerks are hurting us. But in the end, since we as human beings, we vary so much, I in some ways think we have to look at our heart and say, how much am I suffering and what kind of person do I want to be? And I think you kind of got to start there, independently of the objective things that jerks are doing to you, because there's certain sorts of jerks who don't seem to bother other people at all. When I talk to them, I say, that person's being a jerk, and it doesn't bother me at all. So it's just who you are is very important.
There's a dear friend I have in Japan, and that's a very different corporate culture. I think it makes the U.S. at least like corporate light. Yeah, well, he's got the whole abusive system going, and I'm saying you got to get out, you got to get out, you got to get out, and he ended up in his mind coming up with, I guess you call it maybe the savior complex, which is until I can help my team, I don't want to get out.
Yeah, well, so this, especially, by the way, and this is a very admirable trait for people who are leaders. There's great research that shows the leader that you want is somebody who's, I don't know whether you want to be that person, who is guilt prone and who puts your needs ahead of theirs. And he sounds perfect. That's the kind of person I want to work for. But think about how hard it is on somebody like that. They think that nobody else can save them, and they just feel so obligated to others. And, bless them, we do need people like that. But in some ways, they also support the system, because what they do is they're sort of like shock absorbers that enable a dysfunctional system to go on year after year after year. And it's kind of funny. I was talking, my aforementioned friend, Michael Deering, very experienced, severe, loving capitalist. I would describe him as. He's now an early stage venture capitalist, but he's done all sorts of things. So he said, I kind of have mixed feelings about the shock absorbers you have in this book, because some of them, and your friend's a perfect example, what they are is they're methods that we use to help ourselves and help others to enable a dysfunctional system to move forward despite its bad characteristics. And I think that might be happening to your friend in Japan in part.
I would agree with that. One more on this list, and this is one that a lot of people face. I don't want to quit. I'm not a wimp.
Yeah, well, that's a sort of the macho thing. Well, you might not be a wimp, but if you're suffering, if you're having problems, if you're undermining your job prospects, then you might want to realize that you're doing damage to yourself. There was a guy, incredible guy. I did a bunch of emails with him back and forth, and he basically described the sequence over years. He was a police officer, and he rose so far. He was actually acting police chief of his department. And then somebody came in who didn't like him and demoted him. And then he went to Afghanistan, and he's a macho, tough guy. He's literally a warrior. And he comes back, and then they demoted him even further to the lowest possible level without firing him. And they treated him like dirt. They treated him as if he was invisible. And he wrote me, I'm a tough guy. I thought I could take it, but now looking back, I should have gotten out earlier. And that guy to me is almost the model, because I mean he's a patriot. He's serving the country. But he's somebody who would have been better to get out.
Yeah, and he makes me think in Office Space, who was not so macho, but of the red stapler dude.
The red stapler. That might be the greatest movie ever made on workplace stuff. It's fabulous dysfunction and humor.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go from there and let's talk about some more jerk avoidance techniques.
Okay.
And you know, we've been talking about Katie, and she said, "Don't engage with crazy."
Yeah. So this is my friend Katie DeSalle. She's a great researcher. She visited Stanford year before last, and then she was at Harvard, and now she's back at University of Toronto. She studies She studies air rage. She studies temper tantrums by coaches. She studies fights before flights, where people go up and they scream at the people at the counter about various things. And she studies the relationship between prison guards and prisoners, which we've already talked about. She jerks all over her research. Is
she having fun?
She is. She's awesome. Anyway, I'm going to see her in about a month. So I'm talking to Katie. She was next door to me for a year. And I said, so Katie, like, what's the main advice you have after being one of the world's experts on studying jerks? She said, don't engage with crazy when you see it. If you can't get out completely, do everything you can to create as little contact and as much distance as possible. So if you're in a situation where you can't quite get away from the jerks, the toxic coworkers, kind of think of it. It's almost like kryptonite or something. The less exposure you have to it, less frequent, and the further you are from it, the better off you are. And there's some great research, both old classic research by a guy named Tom Allen at MIT, and newer stuff that they've done in open offices where they've tracked employees. And it turns out that if you're in an open office environment, at least based on this research, and you're within 25 feet of a toxic person, so a jerk, the odds you're going to become one, because this stuff's very contagious, remember, and two, the odds you're going to get fired go way, way up. So anything you can just kind of do to create some distance, some other sort of methods, which I just, there's all these disadvantages to the fact that so much of what we do is virtual, and many of us only come into the office occasionally. I think we're both working from home right now.
Yes, absolutely.
For example, I'll go into the office eventually this week, but I work at home a lot, and in part because there's an open office environment, but that's another story around me. And so we can find ways to distance ourselves. So one of the best things we can do when we're involved in, especially a boss relationship or coworker relationship that's really unpleasant and painful, slow it down. When they send you a nasty email, don't send right away. Let them kind of pile up. Maybe send once every couple of weeks. They want to meet once a week. Well, try to slow it down to every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks. And anything you can do to find ways to sort of escape from just to sort of release your exposure to this toxins is very valuable.
Thank you. So, and that slowing down, you talk about a slow rhythm if you're engaging with them directly as well.
So that comes from in the 90s. I did research on telephone bill collectors. So it spent like a month. I got trained as one, and I watched them, and I made the calls and everything. And it was really interesting. They did this in our training, and I watched the experience. These are the people who call us for our Visa and MasterCards when we're late. And the bill collection agency was ranged from the part I worked in was people were only 30 to 60 days late, but there was the really good collectors were the people who dealt with people who were 5 and 6 months late. And they were really good with nasty people. And they actually liked when people started screaming at them because it meant that they cared. But what they do is they talk really slow, really calmly. They'd let them vent, and then they'd be really calm. And the nastier that the person was, the nicer and slower they would be. And I'd listen to these. I'd sit next to them. Their ability to get people to slow down and to, in this case, to direct their attention to the bill was very important. And that's a hard thing to respond to somebody who's anger with calmness, emotional support, a little empathy. But it actually does work. And in the end, by the way, you reduce the behavior and you gain control of the situation.
It sounds to me like Tai Chi too. The more energy or force that they bring in, the more you can work with it. Like you're saying, because that means they're emotionally up, which means they know that they have to pay this or something to that effect. And then if you can, it's fascinating, the energy at play there.
Yeah, and it is, because it does sound like the Tai Chi, that one of the things that they taught us in the bill collector stuff is when they have that negative energy, at least they care. And if you can just sort of flip it around to help you, you're going to be in good shape. That's really cool.
So let's go from there. Let's talk about one more, and then I really want to jump into Becky's story. What are safety zones, and how do we find them when we need them?
So this is the notion. So I've studied the workplace for a long time, and an old, really anthropological tradition is to look at the cracks in organizations where people hide from authorities, from customers who drive them crazy, from coworkers. So these are bathrooms, break rooms. One thing I talk about, and I didn't realize this until I started doing a little investigation. So in Disneyland, they actually have a place, I believe it's in the City Hall, where when customers are being irate, they kind of separate them away from the other customers. There are places you can sort of hide and get away from them. And the example that I have that still sticks with me my whole life is, this is the 1980s. My old friend Dan Dennison and I were at a hospital in Michigan. We're doing an ethnography of nurses. So we're following these surgical nurses around, and we're standing there. We're talking to the head nurse, and she's complaining about this doctor who was a sexual harasser. And so that's not an uncommon conversation. When we look up a second later, and running toward us, we see a nurse running full speed down the hall of the operating room, and there's a doctor grabbing her butt, grabbing her behind, and she goes, "See what I mean?" So we called him Dr. Gooser. And just a few minutes later, after the Dr. Gooser incident, they started going into the nurses' lounge. These 5 or 6 women we were studying. She holds up her. We wanted to follow them. She holds up her hand and said, "Nobody is allowed in here except for nurses. This is where we go to recover from people like him and even researchers like you who are driving us crazy." She shut the door and kept us out. And I just, and we were a little shocked, but after seeing the incident, sometimes places where we can recover, we can give one another social support. In workplaces, that happens all the time, informally and formally. And I think that we all need that to keep going on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. From there, let's talk about mind tricks that protect your soul, and let's talk about West Point and Becky.
Oh, Becky Margiata. So Becky's so let's back up. Mind tricks that protect your soul. A lot of your viewers will probably have heard of cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the leading evidence-based therapies. One of the main ideas of cognitive behavioral therapy is, if you can't change the situation, you change your definition of the situation, so you suffer less emotionally. So my friend, reframing. Yeah. So my friend Becky Margiata, who, incredible woman, she went on to lead something called the 100,000 Homes campaign that found homes for more than 100,000 homeless Americans. She's really somebody who's tough and going to do stuff. So Becky, she's 18. She goes to West Point. She's a first-year plebe. We all know about the hazing that happens. And so she describes, she's there like the first week, and things are happening, such as the upper-class cadets will ask her to summarize every story that was on the front page of the New York Times that morning. Classic question. Becky can't remember it, and they start getting an inch from her nose and scream at her and tell her how useless and lazy she is and everything, the classic hazing. And she said, so after about a week or two, I started, instead of getting upset, I started viewing them as skilled comedians. And the nastier the insults, the meaner they were, the more I admired them and the funnier I thought they were. And so this is this reframing thing of seeing something as funny, seeing something is not harmful, this idea of reframe. And that's a pretty difficult situation to reframe in. It also shows you how tough a person Becky Margiata is. But anything we can do, and this is just an extreme funny case, when we're in a situation where we can't get out, at least for now, reframing in such a way that it doesn't hurt our soul quite as much can be very valuable.
Awesome. And I guess she even at some point started chuckling at them because they were so over the top.
And then you get in more trouble because you're like giggling when they're screaming at you, and then they scream at you even more. So she gets in this anyhow. But she survived it quite well, actually. And she also, the other thing is, she said that when she became an upper class cadet, she hazed less, and she learned to do the things that she took more skill and were less harmful. So she learned something on the other side.
Kindness, compassion, and benevolence. I like it. Let's go from there to a topic that I say that I'm a lover. I'm not a fighter. But is there a time in this situation to fight back?
Yeah, well, there is a time to fight back and or to try to just change the behavior you're dealing with. It isn't always like, I'm going to beat you down or anything. But deciding to confront the person, there's certain things you might want to consider. Mm-hmm. One is, we've already talked about power. The more power you have, the less likely you'll get hurt. The second one is, if you have a posse, if you have a bunch of people on your side, that's very powerful. And the third thing is documentation. If you can document the situation, you get out of the he said, she said situation. So just to me, almost a perfect example is years ago, a woman wrote me. She actually, I believe, was a dog catcher. She was an animal control officer. And they had this coworker who was constantly yelling at all of them, was saying racist things to them. There were all these problems. So they go to their boss occasionally, and he wouldn't do anything about it. So what they did was they put together, I'm going to use the J word, they put together jerk diaries. Her and her coworkers got together. They documented this coworker's nasty behavior over a couple of week period. They went to the boss, gave him the jerk diaries, and boom, this woman was gone in a couple of weeks. That, if you look at the research about how to deal with a jerk, that's almost textbook. It doesn't always work, but it sure increases your odds of creating a posse, documenting, and then going to the authorities. So that's one situation. And then maybe we can, if you want to talk to, there's some more specific techniques. For me, one of the big things, we talked about different kinds of jerks. There are some people who are jerks intentionally. They think that by treating others badly, it helps them get ahead. But some people don't mean to be jerks. And when you give them the news, it actually helps them. So if you have somebody like that, especially a more temporary jerk in your workplace, and it sounds like a little bit of this happened to you, pulling them aside, having the conversation with them can be very effective sometimes. So that's, to me, the best of, that's where everybody has good intentions, but there's cluelessness. Sometimes it's not so pretty. One of the examples I talk about is a guy who was, we'll call him a major jerk, major A, if we will. So this was a woman who wrote me, and she said she had a guy from the military who didn't seem to understand anything. And there's research on Machiavellian people are like this, that people for whom, when they're nasty to us and we are nice to them, they take it as a sign of weakness. So she tried to be nice to him, but she gave up, and she just called him out and said he was ruining her life. He was being abusive. His behavior was unacceptable. And when he got the push back, then he stopped fighting. So I guess one way to put it is know your jerk. And this is that different sorts of jerks require different sorts of pushback. And that's why I wanted to come up with a one-size-fits-all solution to dealing with all jerks. But unfortunately, we are all in such different situations. We can think about different tactics, but we've got to craft our own set of responses.
It's a fun little story. I went on to become a professional cyclist. I raced in Europe for a few years. But before that, I was finishing up college, and there'd been an upperclassman who had been a jerk to me on the cycling team. And then one day he shows up at the track, and I was pretty okay on the velodrome for cycling. And he gets out on the track beneath me, and he tried to cut me off or something. And I ended up putting my knee between his handlebars. He was below me, between his arm and his chest. And I just, for a whole lap, kept thumping him into the chest with my knee. Thump, 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 and put him into his place. And then I went about my race, and I did very well. And at the end, you expect there's going to be a fist fight. Right. Because here's this guy who had been treating me like a jerk for years, and now here I was thumping him with my knee. And he came up to me and he said, "What a great race. It was so great to see you," and wanted to be friends.
Well, so I guess that's a know your jerk situation, but it's also a situation that it sounded like you needed to earn his respect, and you did it quite effectively. But I do think there's times, and I say, like, I talk about jerks. I'm not writing The Power of Nice or anything. There's times when you actually do need to push back, and that seemed to me like that was the propitious moment where you had both the power and people like that who are probably more authoritarian personality. Mm-hmm. When they realize they're looking up to you, then they'll start getting nice, because there's sort of the kiss up, kick down sort of person. He might have had a little bit of that too.
Well, I guess he was literally beneath me on the track as I was riding above him, so he was looking up.
He must have been a very skilled bicyclist. That takes a lot of skill.
So I had enough. Thank you. Let's talk real briefly, because this kind of goes in that category, though radically differently. The Benjamin Franklin effect for turning jerks into friends.
So what you just described with cycling is a different way to do it. But one of the things, and this goes back to the notion that sometimes people are treating us badly for reasons that are unclear. And maybe if somebody's being nasty, instead of crushing them or forcing them out, which sometimes is necessary, maybe you can turn a hater into a friend. And there's great couple hundred psychological studies that essentially that people who we are kind to, we want to do more favors for, and we think well of them, and people we are nasty to, we think badly of them. So an implication of that, hence the Benjamin Franklin effect, is one little trick is if somebody's being unpleasant or nasty to you, see if you can get them to do you a favor. Because when you do favors for somebody, it's hard to dislike them. And the Benjamin Franklin effect, why it's called that, was when he was a young man and he was an up-and-comer, and even though he was poorly educated, tried to make his way in Philadelphia society. There was a local wealthy guy with a nice library who was bad-mouthing Franklin behind his back, making speeches about what an unsavory person he was. Instead of getting mad at him, what Franklin did was he asked him if he could borrow one of the rare books he had in his great collection. So the guy did him a favor, and then Benjamin Franklin wrote him this real nice thank you note and sent the book back. And Franklin said from then on, they were friends throughout the rest of their life. So it's a little bit tricky, but sometimes when you've got a jerk on your hand, we talked about this with petty tyrants, showing them some respect, some love bombing sometimes works because that's what they need. And some of these methods aren't always going to work, but getting the jerk on your side is sometimes a lot easier than just battling them the rest of your life.
I love it. And that is a woohoo! Where does self-love fit into the picture?
Ooh, I've never been asked this question before. So if I have a reaction to that, my reaction is that the more confident in loving we are of ourselves, the easier it is to pass along the same to others. And if we're angry, if we're insecure, that's where we often start being unpleasant. And I think a lot of times with jerks, it's because they have an insecurity rather than the fact that they're just mean people. So so that's where I would take that with self-love, that if you can have love and understanding and some self-forgiveness rather than that insecurity, you might be better off. I hadn't thought of that before, but I think that's true.
Thank you. And that leads directly, because it makes me think actually of kids on the playground. And it didn't go for so well for me in my early years on the playground.
Yeah, me neither.
Oh, no. But if we had cranked up that either confidence or inner flame toward ourselves, I think we would have seemed like less of a target potentially to others.
I think that's right. And then the other thing, we're getting to schoolyard bullying, but it plays out for the rest of life. There's two parts. One is that if you have more confidence and love in yourself, and the other thing, and this is one of one of my two mantras for the book, that it's on you and you're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
To the extent that when people are viewed as weak and are as targets, that we can try to look at it from their perspective, so we can show some empathy and understanding for them. Very often it does help. And that's why we're talking about the petty tyrants. And anybody who is sort of a social outcast who tends to get bullied, a lot of times by taking their perspective and showing some caring for them, they will become less bullying. Because there's interesting research on schoolyard bullying that basically says there's two main kinds of bullies. One is the cool kids. Mm-hmm. The captain of the football team is sort of the stereotype, who just sort of pushes everybody around and establishes their place. That bicyclist guy who you had to bring down might have been an example of that. And then or almost bring down. And then the other kind are the outcasts, the rebels, the uncool kids. Mm-hmm. And we get the same thing in life, that people who don't feel respected, by showing them a little bit of love and respect, I think that very often it's better for them and it's better for us too.
Thank you. So bringing it then full circle, one of the ways, and I'm thinking of the DMV, and I had a great experience. I tried. I when I go to the DMV, I am bringing love and light, because if not, I'm going to be brought down. But go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I want to hear what you're saying.
No, you first.
Well, so I just love the example of the DMV, because it is funny. The last couple of times in DMV, we have terrible lines in California. The last couple of times I went to the DMV, one thing I like about it is that you're all waiting with all these people in a similar situation. Either you can be grouchy, or you can kind of bond with them and become friends. And one thing about the DMV, and I had to go to the Social Security office recently too, is at least I get to see a much wider range of people of all kinds at different stages in life than I do in the little bubbles I live in. So it's actually a good opportunity for understanding people who are different than you and hanging out with them, because you're just stuck with them anyways. You might as well get to know them and like them. And
love
once
it.
you're talking to people, they're always great. So I like your attitude.
And so I brought that to the DMV, exactly what you're saying. And then my job was to make friends with the woman behind the counter and do whatever I could. And it turned into I never experienced this at the DMV, where she actually used the words, "I'm going to let that slide."
No. Now that's the opposite of a petty tyrant. That's somebody breaking the rules on your behalf. That's perfect.
So, and that was bringing the love, bringing that love to that situation. No matter what, I don't care what happens. I am going to help you have a great day, period.
That's just fabulous. So to me, that's exactly the opposite and exactly the same, the same mechanism. Because what you do is, she might be like that with everybody, but I'd imagine by being, if you will, warm and caring, it helped a lot.
Yeah. I was going to ask a question for parents and their kids, and specifically since we talked briefly about bullying, but you were talking about teens. So where were you going with that?
Oh, well, I was talking about for those of us who, we tend to think of the stereotype as we teach our children. I don't know how much I've taught my children, but I've learned so much from them. It's unbelievable. And from 30-something years of teaching Stanford students, I hope I've taught them something. But my goodness, every day they teach me something new. And one of the advantages of having teenage children, now my youngest is 21, but having gone through a series of teenage children, is the gift they give you, which can be very painful, is they will tell you the truth about themselves, about you, in a way that no one else will. And when you accept the truth from them, rather than, especially if it's negative, rather than getting mad at them, I think sometimes it can actually help you. So that's one thing. And it's funny, when I talk to groups of CEOs, every now and then I'll do it. I'll say, how many of you have teenage children? I ask them to raise their hands. And one of my favorite ones, so he was describing how he was feeling really kind of puffed up. And he was CEO, feeling really important. And his son is actually in a baseball league with Steve Young, the San Francisco 49ers retired quarterback. And he says, I'm feeling really puffed up, and I pick up my kid at baseball practice, and he goes, I wish I had a cool dad like Steve Young.
Oh,
and he's like, oh. And he said, So I wasn't feeling quite so full of myself. And he said I was getting kind of puffed up. And I really sort of liked that, because in the thing he told, to the guy's credit, he told the story about himself. I thought that's a good way to sort of get your head a little bit smaller. And you may need other things too. Sometimes my kids would say positive things about me too. They're not just negative.
Yay. So what would you tell parents to help their kids with dealing with jerks?
Oh, it's so difficult. For me, one of the main things to start out with, and I'm just thinking of my own kids, is that somehow or another, if they are under the delusion that there's this one jerk and it's not going to be like that the rest of their lives, to me, it's a skill that you have to deal with the rest of your life, of knowing how to take it and to bite your lip, knowing when and how you're going to maybe push back so you'll actually win. And then the other thing, and I think this is true for kids and for adults, is to taking responsibility for when you're adding to the problem. Because a lot of this, of course, with the kids goes on online, on Facebook, Instagram, texting or whatever. And to realize that when somebody says something that might upset you, that when you throw the fire back, you're creating a vicious circle and to try to withdraw. And to maybe even throw in some sort of positive emotion. But boy, for the modern kids today, it's 24/7. It never stops. I remember when my daughters were in high school, that if you weren't on Facebook the night before, you couldn't go in the next day because you couldn't understand the social dynamics and why people were acting the way that was. There's this constant, almost 24-hour vigilance they needed just to navigate their social lives and their next day at school. It's not easy being a kid these days.
Wow. So on a positive note, few last wrap-up questions. First off, what personally brings you the greatest happiness, or what I call the woohoo factor?
I'm a pretty boring introvert. The things that makes me happiest.
I'm not buying it, Bob.
No. I pretend to be an extrovert now, and then I'll go hide for a few hours. Spending a quiet, long walk with my wife. We just went to Lassen National Park. It was just beautiful, and it was hardly anybody there. Just a night. That's something I love. And then the other thing that makes me happy, and I love riding by myself. And then I'm not an accomplished biker like you, but going for a nice, by my standards, long bike ride, nice and slowly. That makes me feel good. When I've had a day when I've written something I like and gone for a bike ride, I feel like that's a good day.
Woohoo!
Yeah, so it's not woohoo, but it's kind of the introvert's woohoo.
I like it. So on that note, where can people go to find out more and to find your beautiful books?
Probably the best place to go is bobsutton.net, which has got all sorts of different things about my work, and it features this book because it's about ready to come out. But that's probably the best place to go, bobsutton.net. It's got information about the book, but also my other projects at Stanford and other books and the like. And I just experimented with a podcast on organizational friction, so you can see a little bit about that. But that's bobsutton.net is just probably the best place to go for one-stop shopping, if you will.
Fantastic. And if you didn't catch bobsutton.net, come on over to inspirenationshow.com and we'll get you over to bobsutton.net.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been fantastic. For everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, get the whole survival guide, send some love, and shine bright. Woohoo! Thank you so much, Bob.
Thank you so much. That was really fun.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like below. Also, leave your comments. Have some real fun with it. Subscribe to our channel where you're going to get more great videos, more interviews coming up. And check out our website, inspirenationshow.com. That's where you'll find tips, blogs, information, videos you won't find anywhere else, and useful and helpful resources to really help you kickstart your life and to shine bright. Thanks so much again. Thank you for your support. Like, comment, subscribe. See the website. Thanks so much and have fun. Of course, shine bright. Woohoo!